The Varaxian warship cut through the darkness of space like a blade through water. It was massive, nearly 2 kilometers long, and it had been hunting in this sector for 3 days. Commander Zethos stood on the bridge, his 4 eyes scanning the star charts displayed on the holographic screen before him. His scaled skin was the color of dried blood, and when he smiled, rows of needle-sharp teeth caught the dim light. "Commander," one of his officers called out, "we have detected a vessel. Human design. Cargo class." Zethos turned slowly. The Varaxian Empire had conquered 17 star systems in the past decade. They had crushed species that were older than humanity by thousands of years. They had broken civilizations that once thought themselves unbreakable. And now they had found new prey. "How many life signs?" Zethos asked. 12, Commander. Bring them to me." The cargo vessel was called the Wanderer. It was not a military ship. It carried supplies between colonies, medicine and food and machine parts. The crew were not soldiers. They were workers, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs in the vast emptiness between stars. Captain Nathan Burke was the first to see the Varaxian ship appear on his sensors. He was a tall man in his 40s with gray at his temples and worry lines around his eyes. He had been flying cargo routes for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like the vessel that was now bearing down on them. "All hands," he said into the ship's communication system. His voice calmed despite the fear growing in his chest. "We have contact with an unknown vessel. Prepare for possible boarding." In the engine room, Megan Cole looked up from the pipe she had been fixing. She was 32 years old, average height, with short brown hair and hands that were always stained with grease. She had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, spent her childhood fixing tractors and trucks, and had joined a cargo crew because she wanted to see the stars. She never expected the stars to show her monsters. "Megan," called Kyle Patterson, the ship's navigator, over the intercom. "Get to the main deck. Captain wants everyone together." She wiped her hands on a rag and moved quickly through the narrow corridors. The ship was shaking now. Something had locked onto them, pulling them toward the massive warship like a fish caught on a line. When the Varaxians boarded, they did not ask questions. They did not negotiate. Soldiers in black armor moved through the Wanderer like a flood, grabbing crew members and dragging them toward the airlock. Megan watched as her friends were thrown to the ground, bound with energy restraints and herded like animals. One of the Varaxian soldiers stopped in front of her. He was taller than any human she had ever seen, nearly 3 meters, and his 4 eyes studied her with cold interest. "This one is small," he said in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Weak." Megan said nothing. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best thing to do was stay quiet and watch. Her father had taught her that when she was young, watching storms roll across the plains. "You cannot fight a tornado," he had told her. "But you can survive one if you pay attention." The crew of the Wanderer was taken to the Varaxian ship and locked in holding cells. The cells were cold and dark, with walls made of some metal that absorbed all warmth. Megan sat in the corner, her back against the wall, and listened. The Varaxians talked openly in front of them, not caring if the humans heard. Why would they care? To them, humans were nothing. Just another weak species to be conquered and forgotten. "The death pit needs new content," one guard said to another. "The High Council wants a broadcast tomorrow. These humans will not last long. Look at them. Soft skin, no claws. No armor. The small female will go first. She will die quickly. It will show the other conquered worlds how pathetic this species is." Megan heard every word. Her heart was beating fast, but her face showed nothing. She had survived tornadoes. She had survived blizzards that buried entire towns. She had survived a childhood of hard work and harder lessons. She was not going to let fear control her now. Captain Burke moved closer to her in the darkness of the cell. "Megan," he whispered. "I heard what they said. We have to find a way to stop this." "There is no way to stop it," she replied quietly. "Not from in here. But I can survive it. No one survives the death pit. I have heard stories. The Varaxians use it to break the spirits of entire civilizations. They throw prisoners in and broadcast their deaths across all the worlds they have conquered. Megan looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that made the captain fall silent. It was not hope. It was not fear. It was something harder, something forged in years of refusing to give up even when the world seemed determined to crush her. "Then I will be the first," she said. The next morning, Varaxian soldiers came for her. They dragged her from the cell while her crewmates shouted and struggled against their restraints. Kyle Patterson called her name. Captain Burke promised they would find a way to help her. But Megan knew there was no help coming. She was on her own. They took her through long corridors filled with Varaxian soldiers who stopped to stare at her. Some laughed. Some made gestures she did not understand but knew were meant to mock her. She kept her head up and her eyes forward. She was memorizing the layout of the ship, counting the guards, noting the weapons they carried. Information was survival? Her father had taught her that too. The death pit was located at the center of the Varaxian command station, a moon-sized structure orbiting a dead planet. When Megan was brought to the edge, she finally saw what she was facing. The pit was enormous, stretching 3 kilometers across and descending into darkness. She could see the first level below, a landscape of twisted rock and strange vegetation. Things moved in the shadows, large things with too many legs and mouths full of teeth. The air rising from the pit was hot and smelled of blood. Commander Zethos stood on a platform overlooking the arena. Cameras floated around him, broadcasting to 17 conquered star systems. Billions of beings were watching, waiting to see another victim die for their entertainment and horror. "Humans," Zethos announced, his voice booming across the station. "A new species, weak, fragile. Today we show you what happens to those who think they can resist the Varaxian Empire." He turned to look at Megan, expecting to see terror in her eyes. Instead, he saw her studying the pit below, her gaze moving across the terrain like she was solving a puzzle. "Throw her in," Zethos commanded. 2 soldiers grabbed Megan by the arms and lifted her over the edge. For one moment, she hung above the abyss. The hot wind rising around her. She looked back at Commander Zethos and said 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I will see you soon." Then they let go, and she fell into the death pit. Megan fell for what felt like forever. The wind screamed past her ears, and the walls of the pit blurred into streaks of dark stone. She had maybe 3 seconds to think, and in those 3 seconds she made a choice. She was not going to die on impact. She twisted her body in midair, reaching for the wall. Her fingers scraped against rock, tearing skin, but she found a ledge and grabbed it with everything she had. The sudden stop nearly pulled her arms from their sockets. Pain exploded through her shoulders and hands. But she held on. For a long moment she just hung there, breathing hard, blood dripping from her torn fingers. Above her, she could hear the confused murmurs of the Varaxian audience. They had expected her to fall all the way to the bottom. They had expected to watch her body break against the rocks. Instead, she was already doing something no one had done before. She was fighting back. Megan pulled herself onto the ledge and took a moment to look around. The first level of the death pit stretched out before her, a nightmare landscape of black rock and twisted plants that looked like they had grown in poison. The air was thick and hot, hard to breathe. And somewhere in the shadows, things were moving. She could hear them. Clicking sounds like giant insects, low growls that rumbled through the stone beneath her feet. The Varaxians had filled this place with predators, creatures bred and modified to kill anything that entered their territory. Megan stood up slowly. Her hands were bleeding badly, but she ignored the pain. "Pain was just information," her father used to say. "It tells you something is wrong, but it does not have to control you." She needed a weapon. She needed shelter. She needed water. But first, she needed to understand this place. The plants around her were strange. Some had thorns the length of her forearm. Others oozed a thick liquid that smelled like acid. She watched as a small creature, something like a rat with too many eyes, brushed against one of the oozing plants and immediately collapsed. Its body smoking where the liquid had touched it. Toxic. Megan noted, useful. She found a bone on the ground, probably from some previous victim. It was long and thick, the end broken into a sharp point. She picked it up and tested its weight. It would do. The first creature came for her within 10 minutes. It burst from the shadows without warning, a thing called a skrell by the Varaxians. It stood 3 meters tall on 4 powerful legs, its body covered in black armor plates. Its head dominated by a mouth that seemed to split its entire face in half. Rows of teeth, each one the size of a knife, dripped with saliva. The skrell screamed at her, a sound that shook the air and charged. Megan did not run. Running from a predator like this was death. She had learned that growing up around farm animals. You never turn your back on something that wants to kill you. Instead, she moved to the side at the last moment, letting the creature's charge carry it past her. Its claws tore through the air where she had been standing. She swung the bone club at its back leg as it passed, hitting the joint where the armor plates met. The skrell stumbled and screamed again, this time in pain. It turned and came at her again, slower now, limping on its injured leg. Megan was already moving. She had spotted a cluster of the toxic plants nearby. She ran toward them, and the skrell followed, blinded by rage and hunger. At the last second, Megan jumped to the side. The skrell could not stop in time. It crashed into the toxic plants, and the acid-like liquid sprayed across its face and eyes. The creature howled in agony, thrashing blindly, its armored skin smoking and bubbling where the toxin touched it. Megan did not hesitate. She ran forward and drove the pointed end of her bone club into the soft tissue under the creature's jaw, the only spot not protected by armor. She pushed with all her strength, and she felt the bones sink deep. The skrell shuddered once and collapsed. Megan stood over the body, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, adrenaline. She knew this feeling. She had felt it during tornado season, when the sky turned green and the wind tried to tear her house apart. Above her, somewhere in the observation decks, Commander Zethos watched with growing disbelief. The human had been in the pit for less than 15 minutes, and she had already killed a skrell. That should not have been possible. Skrell were apex predators, genetically engineered for maximum lethality. They had torn apart warriors from species far more physically powerful than humans. "Increase the difficulty," Zethos ordered. "Send more skrell? Release the pack." In the holding cells, Captain Nathan Burke and the rest of the Wanderer crew watched the broadcast on a screen. The Varaxians had placed there specifically to break their spirits. They were supposed to watch their crewmate die and lose all hope. Instead, they watched Megan kill a monster, and something else entirely began to grow in their hearts. "How is she doing this?" Kyle Patterson whispered. "She is from Nebraska," said Linda Torres, the ship's medic, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. Back in the pit, Megan heard more clicking sounds approaching. Many more. The pack was coming. She had maybe 2 minutes before they arrived. She worked quickly. Using a sharp rock, she cut strips from the dead skrell's hide. The armor was too thick to penetrate, but the skin underneath was surprisingly flexible. She wrapped pieces around her forearms and hands, creating crude protection. Then she found the toxic plants and carefully collected some of their liquid in a hollow piece of bone. Being very careful not to let it touch her skin, she dipped the end of her weapon in the toxin. Now it was not just a club. It was a poisoned blade. The pack arrived moments later. There were 8 of them, smaller than the first skrell, but faster, their movements coordinated like wolves hunting together. They spread out around her, cutting off escape routes, their 4-eyed heads, turning to track her every movement. Megan picked up a rock with her free hand and threw it at the closest skrell. Not to hurt it, but to distract it. The creature flinched, and in that moment of confusion, she was already moving. She did not try to fight all 8 at once. That would be suicide. Instead, she ran toward a narrow gap between 2 rock formations, a space too small for more than 1 skrell to follow at a time. The pack gave chase, screaming with hunger, but they could only come at her single file. The first one through the gap met her poisoned blade. She stabbed it in the eye, and the toxin did its work instantly. The creature collapsed, blocking the gap and forcing the others to climb over its body. One by one, they came at her. One by one, she killed them. It was not elegant. It was not easy. She took wounds, slashes across her arms and legs, a bite that nearly took off her ear. But she kept fighting, kept moving, kept refusing to die. By the end of the first hour, all 8 Skrell were dead, and Megan Cole stood alone in a field of corpses. She was covered in blood. Her own and theirs. Her body screamed with pain from a dozen wounds. But she was alive. She looked up at the walls of the pit, knowing cameras were watching her every move. She knew Commander Zethos was watching. She knew billions of conquered beings across 17 star systems were watching. She raised her bloody weapon above her head and screamed. Not in fear. Not in pain. In defiance. Then she turned and began walking deeper into the pit. There were more levels below. More horrors waiting. She did not know if she could survive them all, but she was going to find out. The descent to the second level was treacherous. The path wound down through narrow cracks in the rock, sometimes so tight that Megan had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The temperature rose with every step, and soon she understood why this level was called the furnace. Heat washed over her like a physical force. The air shimmered and danced, making it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. The ground beneath her feet was warm, then hot, then almost burning. Pools of molten rock glowed orange and red in the distance. Casting everything in a hellish light, Megan stopped at the entrance to this new level and studied her surroundings. She was a problem solver by nature. Every machine she had ever fixed had taught her the same lesson: observe first, act second. Rushing got people killed. The furnace was a volcanic landscape, but it was not random. She could see patterns in the placement of the lava pools, paths between them where the ground was more stable. This was designed, she realized. The Varaxians had built this level specifically to test the limits of their victims. They wanted to see how long someone could last before the heat cooked them alive. Her first problem was obvious. Her body was not built for this. Humans could survive in hot environments, but not like this. She needed protection. She looked down at the Skrell hide wrapped around her arms. The creatures had lived on the first level, which was cooler than this. But they were descended from something that had evolved in extreme conditions. Their hide might provide some insulation. Working quickly, Megan stripped more material from the Skrell hide she had brought with her. She wrapped it around her feet, creating crude boots. She covered her head, leaving only her eyes exposed. The hide was thick and heavy, but almost immediately she felt the difference. The heat was still brutal, but it was no longer cooking her skin. She moved forward carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The ground was unstable in places, cracking beneath her feet and releasing blasts of scalding steam. She learned to read the surface, to recognize the subtle signs that warned of weak spots. An hour passed. Her water was almost gone. She had found a small trickle on the first level and filled a container she had made from Skrell intestine. But in this heat, she was sweating faster than she could drink. If she did not find more water soon, dehydration would kill her before any predator could. She found it in the most unlikely place. Deep in the furnace, where the heat was most intense, she discovered a network of underground steam vents. The steam was dangerous, hot enough to burn, but where there was steam, there was water. She followed the vents until she found a spot where the steam cooled slightly before escaping into the air. There, moisture collected on the rocks, forming small pools of water that were hot but not boiling. She drank carefully, letting the water cool in her mouth before swallowing. It tasted like minerals and stone, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. Commander Zethos watched the broadcast with growing unease. The human had now survived for 90 minutes. 90 minutes. The previous record in the death pit was 19 minutes, set by a warrior from a species specifically evolved for combat. This human, this small female from a species the Varaxians had dismissed as weak and unworthy, had shattered that record 5 times over. What is she doing now? Demanded High Counselor Vrex, who had joined the observation deck to witness what was becoming an unprecedented event. She appears to be drinking water. High Counselor, Zethos replied, his voice tight with frustration. She found the steam vents. No one has ever found the steam vents. We hid them specifically to deny water to the prisoners. This one found them. Rex leaned forward, his 6 eyes narrowing as he studied the small figure on the screen. Perhaps we underestimated this species. Send the Crusher. Zithos hesitated. The Crusher was a last resort, a massive armored beast that lived in the molten rock itself. It had never been used against a single prisoner before. It was designed for groups, for entire squads of soldiers. Using it against one human seemed excessive, but he gave the order anyway. Megan heard it before she saw it. A rumbling sound like an earthquake, but focused and moving. The lava pools nearby began to bubble and churn. Something was rising from beneath. The Crusher emerged from the molten rock like a nightmare from legend. It was enormous, easily 10 meters tall, with a body covered in thick plates of obsidian black armor. It had no eyes that Megan could see, but it turned toward her immediately. Drawn by her heat signature or her movement or some sense she could not understand, it moved toward her. Slow but inevitable, each step shaking the ground. There was no way to run from something that large. Nowhere to hide from something that could swim through lava. Megan did the only thing she could think of. She stood her ground and watched. The Crusher was massive, but it was also slow. Its armor protected it from the lava, but that same armor made it heavy, made it clumsy on solid ground. And there she saw it. A gap in the plates at its underbelly, where the armor had to flex to allow movement. The creature's one weakness, but how could she reach it? The thing was 10 meters tall. Even if she got close enough, she could not strike high enough to hit anything vital. She looked around desperately. The terrain was her only ally. And there she saw her answer. A tall rock formation, a spire of hardened lava that rose nearly as high as the Crusher itself. If she could climb it, if she could time her jump perfectly, she might have one chance. She ran. Not away from the Crusher, but toward it, then past it, heading for the rock spire. The creature turned to follow, faster than she expected, its massive legs eating up the distance between them. Megan reached the spire and began to climb. The rock was hot, burning her hands even through the Skrell hide. She climbed anyway, pulling herself up meter by meter while the ground shook. Beneath her, the Crusher reached the base of the spire and began to climb after her. It was not built for climbing, but it was strong enough to simply tear chunks out of the rock and pull itself up. The spire shuddered with each of its movements. Megan reached the top, just as the Crusher's massive head rose level with her. Its mouth opened, revealing a furnace within, hot enough to melt steel. She did not hesitate. She jumped. For one terrifying moment, she was airborne, falling toward the creature's head. Then she landed on its neck, grabbed onto a gap in its armor plates, and held on with all her strength. The Crusher thrashed, trying to shake her off. She could feel the heat of its body through her makeshift clothing, burning her even through the Skrell hide. But she did not let go. She pulled out her poisoned blade and drove it into the gap at the base of the creature's skull, where its armor was thinnest. The toxin that had killed Skrell so quickly had less effect on something this large, but it was still enough. The Crusher screamed, a sound like mountains breaking, and its movements became wild, uncontrolled. Megan held on until the creature collapsed. Then she let go and fell to the ground, rolling to absorb the impact. She lay there for a long moment, gasping for breath, her body screaming with pain and heat exhaustion, but she was alive. The Crusher was not. In the observation deck, High Counselor Rex rose from his seat. His face, usually so composed, showed something that might have been fear. What have we found? He whispered. Commander Zethos had no answer. He could only watch as the human slowly got to her feet and began walking once more. Descending toward the third and final level of the death pit, the abyss awaited her. The entrance to the abyss was a hole in the ground, perfectly round, as if something massive had punched through the rock. There was no light below, no sound. Just absolute darkness that seemed to swallow everything that came near it. Megan stood at the edge and stared down into nothing. Her body was broken in a dozen ways. Burns covered her arms and legs. The bite wound near her ear had stopped bleeding but throbbed with every heartbeat. She had lost count of the cuts and bruises. Every breath hurt, but she was still standing. And as long as she was standing, she was fighting. She took a moment to prepare. She still had some of the toxic liquid from the first level, carefully stored in her bone container. She still had her weapon, though it was chipped and worn from use. She gathered materials from the furnace, pieces of glowing rock that still held heat. Wrapping them in layers of skrell, hide to carry with her, light she would need light, then she descended into the abyss. The darkness was total. Even with her makeshift torch, she could only see a few meters in any direction. The walls of the descent were smooth, almost polished, and cold after the brutal heat of the furnace. The temperature dropped rapidly as she climbed down, until her breath came out in clouds of mist. The silence was worse than anything she had faced so far. In the first level, she could hear the skrell hunting. In the furnace, she could hear the rumble of lava and the hiss of steam. Here, there was nothing. Just her own breathing and the pounding of her heart. She remembered childhood nights on the farm, when the power would go out during storms and she would have to navigate the barn in complete darkness. Her father would send her to check on the animals, and she would move through the black spaces with only her hands and her memory to guide her. She had learned to move without sight, to sense the space around her by the way air moved and sound echoed. Those lessons saved her life. Now, she felt the attack before she heard it. A change in the air pressure, a whisper of movement from her left. She threw herself to the right just as something massive swept through the space where she had been standing. Claws scraped against stone, throwing sparks that briefly illuminated a nightmare. The creature was long and serpentine, covered in pale, translucent skin that showed dark veins beneath. It had no eyes, just a head dominated by a mouth filled with needle-thin teeth. It hunted by sound and heat, she realized. The warm rocks she carried were drawing it to her like a beacon. Megan made a choice. She threw one of her heat rocks as far as she could, and immediately moved in the opposite direction. Pressing herself against the cold wall and holding her breath, the creature turned and lunged toward the falling rock, its jaws snapping closed on empty air. By the time it realized its mistake, Megan was already moving again. Deeper into the darkness, she learned to use the environment against her hunters. The abyss was filled with these blind predators, but they were not intelligent. They reacted to stimuli, to heat and sound, and she could manipulate those things. She would throw rocks to create noise, then move silently in another direction. She would leave heat sources behind to draw the creatures away from her path. When she had to fight, she fought smart. The creatures were fast, but fragile compared to the armored skrell and the massive crusher. Her poisoned blade was devastating against their soft skin. But every fight cost her. Every wound slowed her down. Every drop of blood she lost was energy she would never get back. An hour into the abyss, she found the nest. It was a massive cavern, filled with hundreds of the blind serpent creatures coiled together in a writhing mass. The exit, she could see by the faint light filtering through cracks in the stone, was on the other side. There was no way through. Not by force, not by stealth. Hundreds of creatures, all of them capable of killing her in seconds. Even if she tried to sneak past, the slightest sound would wake them all. Megan sat in the darkness, her back against the cold stone, and thought. Her father had always told her that every problem had a solution. You just had to find it. Sometimes the solution was obvious. Sometimes it was hidden. Sometimes it was something you had to create yourself. She looked at what she had. A poisoned blade. A container of toxin. Some heat rocks. The clothes on her back, most of which were strips of skrell hide. The skrell hide. She remembered how she had taken it from the first creature she killed, how it had protected her from the heat of the furnace. The skrell were apex predators of the first level. Their scent would be all over this hide. Would the creatures of the abyss recognize that scent? Would they fear it? There was only one way to find out. She rubbed the hide all over her body, covering herself in the scent of something that did not belong in this darkness. Then she began to move, slowly, carefully, toward the nest. The first creature she passed lifted its head and turned toward her. Its nostrils, set just above its mouth, flared as it took in her scent. Then it hissed and drew back, confused by the smell of something that should not be here, something dangerous. Megan kept moving. Every step was agony. Every second she expected to feel teeth closing on her flesh, but the creatures did not attack. They hissed and shifted, disturbed by her passage, but they did not strike. The scent of the Skrull was enough to make them hesitate, enough to buy her the seconds she needed. She reached the other side of the cavern and began to climb toward the light. Behind her, she could hear the creatures starting to stir, their confusion turning to anger as they realized they had been tricked. But she was already moving, pulling herself up toward the cracks in the stone, toward the exit. Her wounded arm gave out halfway up. She hung by one hand for a terrible moment, her muscles screaming, her grip slipping. Below, she could hear the creatures surging toward her, drawn by the sound of her struggle. Megan thought about giving up. It would be so easy. Just let go. Just fall. The pain would end. The struggle would be over. But then she thought about her crew, still trapped in Varaxian cells. She thought about Captain Burke, who had always believed in her. She thought about Kyle and Linda and the others watching this broadcast. Hoping against hope that she would survive, she thought about her father, standing on the porch of their farmhouse, watching a tornado tear across the fields toward them. He had not run. He had stood his ground, held his family together, and rebuilt everything the storm destroyed. Megan Cole was her father's daughter. She reached up with her wounded arm, grabbed the ledge above her, and pulled. The pain was beyond anything she had ever felt. She screamed, but she did not let go. She pulled herself up, one agonizing centimeter at a time, until she was through the crack and lying on the stone floor of a tunnel behind her. She could hear the creatures screaming in frustration, unable to follow through the narrow gap. She had made it. She had survived the abyss. Ahead she could see light. Real light, not the glow of lava or the flicker of her makeshift torch. The light of the arena above. The exit was close. She got to her feet one more time. She had been in the death pit for nearly 2 hours now. Her body was shutting down. Her vision was blurring. Every step felt like walking through water. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, toward the light, toward the exit, toward whatever came next. She was not going to die in this hole. Not today. The tunnel led upward, and with every step, the light grew stronger. Megan moved like someone in a dream, her mind disconnected from her body, operating on pure willpower alone. She could not feel her legs anymore. She could barely see through the blood and sweat dripping into her eyes. But she kept moving. The exit was a massive circular door sealed with technology she did not understand. But as she approached, sensors detected her presence, and the door began to grind open. No one had ever reached this door before. The Varaxians had built it as a formality, never expecting anyone to actually use it. Light flooded through the widening gap. Megan shielded her eyes, blinded after so long in darkness. She stumbled forward, fell to her knees, and then forced herself to crawl. When her legs finally gave out, she crawled through the door and into the arena floor. The roar of the audience was deafening. Thousands of Varaxians packed the observation decks, and for a moment they were completely silent, stunned into disbelief by what they were seeing. Then the noise erupted, a wall of sound that was part shock, part horror, and something else that might have been awe. Megan Cole, the small human female from Nebraska, crawled out of the death pit. She was covered in blood, hers and others. Her clothes were torn, her skin burned and cut and bitten. One arm hung at a strange angle where something had nearly torn it from her shoulder. She should have been dead 10 times over, but she was alive. Commander Zethos stood on the observation platform, frozen in place. He had watched every second of the past 2 hours, and he still could not understand what he had witnessed. This human had faced predators designed to kill the strongest warriors. She had survived environments meant to break the most resilient species. She had done what no one in the history of the Varaxian Empire had ever done, and now she was looking up at him. Megan raised her head, her eyes finding the command platform through the glare of the arena lights. She saw Zithos standing there, his scaled face twisted with disbelief. She saw the cameras floating around her, broadcasting her image across 17 conquered star systems. She got to her feet. It took 3 tries. Her body screamed with every movement. But she stood because she refused to face them on her knees. "Is that all?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the arena's sound systems caught it and amplified it across the stadium. Those 3 words echoed through the observation decks, through the broadcast networks, through every world that had watched the death pit claim victims for decades. "Is that all?" In the holding cells, Captain Nathan Burke fell to his knees. He was laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by an emotion too big to contain. Kyle Patterson stood with his mouth open, unable to speak. Linda Torres was already moving, banging on the cell door, screaming for the guards to let them out. Across the conquered star systems, something began to change. On a dozen worlds, beings who had given up hope watched a small human stand up after 2 hours in hell and ask if that was the best their conquerors could do. On prison planets and slave colonies, whispers began to spread. If she could survive, maybe there was a chance. Maybe resistance was not futile after all. Commander Zethos did not know what to do. His training had not prepared him for this. His species had conquered worlds by breaking spirits, by showing that resistance was pointless, that death was inevitable for anyone who opposed them. But this human had not broken. She had faced everything they could throw at her and was still standing. "Seize her," he ordered, his voice strained. "Take her to medical. Keep her alive. I want to know how this happened." Soldiers moved toward Megan, surrounding her with weapons drawn. She did not resist. She could barely stand, let alone fight. But as they took her arms and began to lead her away, she looked back at the cameras one more time. "Tell everyone," she said. "Tell them we do not give up. Tell them we do not stop fighting. Tell them that if you throw us into the dark, we will claw our way back out. Every single time." The broadcast cut to black, but it was too late. The message had already spread. 3 days later, rebellion erupted across 7 of the conquered star systems simultaneously. The timing was not coincidence. The leaders of the resistance had been planning for months, waiting for a spark to ignite their movements. Megan Cole had given them that spark. On the Varaxian command station, chaos reigned. Reports flooded in of uprisings, of soldiers being overwhelmed, of slave populations turning against their masters. High Counselor Vrex demanded answers that no one could provide. How had this happened? How had one human changed everything? In the confusion, no one noticed when the prisoners from the Wanderer escaped their cells. Captain Burke had made friends among the prison guards, beings from conquered worlds who had seen the broadcast and remembered what hope felt like. They opened the doors, provided weapons, and looked the other way. The crew fought their way to the docking bay, where a small transport ship sat waiting. Kyle Patterson took the pilot seat while Linda Torres tended to the wounded. And in the back of the ship, on a stretcher they had stolen from the medical bay, lay Megan Cole. She was barely conscious, her body fighting to recover from injuries that should have killed her. But when Captain Burke leaned over her, she opened her eyes and smiled. "Did we make it?" she whispered. "We made it," Burke replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You made it. You saved us all." "Good," she said. "Then wake me up when we get home. I need to sleep." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 days, she slept without nightmares. The transport ship broke free of the Varaxian station and made the jump to hyperspace before pursuit could be organized. 3 days later, they arrived in Earth-controlled space, where a fleet of defense vessels was waiting to escort them home. The story of Megan Cole had already reached Earth. Every news network was broadcasting footage smuggled from the conquered systems. The humans of Earth watched their daughter crawl out of the death pit, stand on broken legs, and challenge an empire to do its worst. She became a symbol. Not because she was the strongest or the fastest or the most skilled. She became a symbol because she was ordinary. She was a mechanic from a farm in Nebraska who had done the impossible simply by refusing to quit. When the Wanderer crew finally landed on Earth, they were greeted by crowds that stretched to the horizon. But Megan did not see them. She was still unconscious, being rushed to a hospital where doctors would spend weeks. Putting her body back together, Dr. Burke spoke to the cameras instead. Standing on the landing platform with tears in his eyes, The Varaxians thought they knew what humans were, he said. They thought we were soft, weak, easy to break. They were wrong. They threw our friend into the darkest hole they could find, and she climbed back out and asked for more. That is who we are. That is what it means to be human. We do not stay down. We never stop fighting. And now the galaxy knows it too. A year later, the Varaxian Empire signed a treaty with the Earth Defense Coalition. The conquered systems were freed. The Death Pit was destroyed, its arena buried under tons of rubble. Megan Cole went back to fixing engines. She never sought fame, never asked for recognition. When reporters came to interview her, she would shrug and say she just did what she had to do, but every year, on the anniversary of her emergence from the pit, she would receive messages from across the galaxy, from beings who had watched her fight and found the courage to fight themselves. From children who had been born free because she had refused to die. She kept those messages in a box by her bed. And on the nights when the memories came back, when she could still feel the heat of the furnace and hear the screams of the creatures in the abyss, she would read them and remember why it had all been worth it. She had crawled out of hell with one question on her lips. Is that all? And the answer she had proven was yes. That was all they had. And it was not enough to stop a human being. It never would be.